All right, so we're beginning a new chapter called the Industrial Gilded Age. It's basically a period from 1865 to 1900. 1865 marks the end of the Civil War. Now, if you've been paying attention, you realize that Migration West and Jim Crow also took place in this time. Migration West is the story of the West in this time. Jim Crow is the story of the South in this time. Now we're going to do the northeast of the country, which is basically, like if this was a map of the United States, it'd be about right here, New York, Washington, D.C., stuff like that, okay? So, transportation and communication, life in the 1870s, okay? So, if you look right here, this is a colorized photograph, actually, from the 1800s, okay? This is New York City, around 5th Avenue, which is one of the richest neighborhoods in New York City. This is where all the people with money lived, okay, in the city. Now, you'll notice that they have horse-drawn carriages. This right here is actually a kerosene lantern that they would use as headlights, okay? That was their version of a taxi back then. You have all these guys waiting to pick up somebody. All right, so what was common to life in the 1870s? This is multiple choice question number 1. Okay. All right. Dirt roads and horse-drawn carriages. Big surprise. Okay. So as time went on, first we start with dirt roads, then we get gravel roads, and then we get paved roads like we have today. There were no cars. Later on, there are going to be cars, but the first cars are built by master mechanics, and it took them about a year to build a car because every piece had to be hand engineered. So we have a nice picture of a carriage there, okay, in New York City. We have oil lamps, okay. The original oil lamps were whale oil, okay. They would take whale fat and they would boil it down and they would extract the oil from it. But eventually they came out with a new kind of oil, okay. That's going to be kerosene. And it actually is brighter and it burns cleaner with less smoke, okay. All right, wood stoves, okay, namely Franklin stoves. So a Franklin stove is a big potbelly stove. They call it that because it's kind of round on the edges, and you have a flat cooking surface on the top. So you would have to go out and chop firewood and all that kind of stuff. Hand water pumps, okay? I'm sure you've probably seen this in the movies or maybe at your grandparents' or your parents' house where you have a handle and you keep pumping the thing, right? And then the water eventually flows out. That's a hand water pump. Okay, so there was no indoor plumbing. That stuff did not really exist unless you were super wealthy. Saturday night baths, okay? Yes, you heard me correctly, Saturday night baths. So they used to keep the bathtub, for the most part, in the country it would be outside, but in the city it's gonna be inside. You know those big claw tubs, the one that have these claw feet at the bottom? Okay, those are actually meant to be outside where you can build a fire underneath this big cast iron tub and heat the water. And then the plug at the bottom, when you pull the plug, the water runs all over the fire and it puts it out, okay? Well, if you had to use a hand water pump to fill one of these big old cast iron tubs, that's a lot of work. So families typically ran the water and they would heat it up, and then they would take a bath in order of respect, okay? So typically speaking, the father, the guy that went to work all week, he went first, okay? He got in the tub and he cleaned himself, and then the mother would get in after that, and they wouldn't switch the water. And then the children would actually get in the tub in order of the age that they were born. So the oldest went first, the youngest went last. There used to be an old saying that was, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this is actually where it came from. Okay, the point being that the bathwater was typically so dirty by the time the baby got into it that you might lose the baby in the bathwater and forget whenever you're throwing out the bathwater. Typically we had one-room schoolhouses, okay? So schoolhouse would probably be about the size of my classroom, something like that. Typically with a blackboard, several desks, and a fireplace towards the back, or towards the front, I mean. Now, whenever you're going to school, they would have all the grades, 1 through 8, all in one building, okay? And the older kids would teach the younger kids while the teacher was busy. So you might end up teaching 2 or 3 of your siblings while the teacher is teaching other students other material, okay? Also, you were required during the winter time, if you were in a cold environment, to bring firewood, okay, to the schoolhouse. And whoever brought the most firewood got to sit closest to the fire. Whoever brought the least firewood got to sit farthest back from the fire. That's typically how it worked. All right. 75% of Americans in the 1870s live in rural towns. You know the word rural, right? Rural means outside of the city, okay? Rural villages had a blacksmith shop. This is a typical blacksmith shop. This is actually a colorized photograph from the 1800s. And a blacksmith, their job is to manipulate iron, to build things out of iron, okay? So small towns had family-owned factories usually, and everybody in the family worked at the factory. So it's a family affair, and usually the factory would get passed on to the oldest son whenever the father retired. By 1920, most people lived in an urban setting, and America became the world's largest industrial power. So around the turn of the century, between the 1870s and the 1820s, we see this flip where people aren't living so much in the country anymore, they're living in cities. 1920 census recorded for the first time more people living in cities than in the countryside, okay?